launch of Science Gallery's first digital or online-only exhibition, Phytopia. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Jahnavi Phalkey, and I am leading the establishment of Science Gallery Bengaluru in the city of Bangalore. We are a part of an international network of galleries across 8 cities in the world, and we are university linked with a target audience of about 15 to 28-year-olds. But that said, our public engagement programming, of course, is targeted at everybody. We call ourselves a public institution for research-based engagement. And research in the natural and human sciences, in art and engineering, are all just as equally important to us. We would like to create a vibrant space where interaction between colleagues from all sorts of professions and all kinds of likes and dislikes can flourish together, thrive together, and come up with interesting research questions, which we firmly believe can come from anywhere and not necessarily only from leading conferences in your field or from journals in your field as well. Phytopia is an exhibition that deals with everything around plants. It's a utopia about plants. That's where the idea for calling this exhibition by that name came from. For those of you who were able to join us for Pradip Krishen's talk that just ended a few minutes ago, thank you very much for joining us in the lecture. Please do drop your feedback in the form which has been uploaded in the chat box and send us your question and answers as we proceed with this evening. Please allow me to introduce this evening's speakers, but before I do, I'll introduce the speakers, following which I will also give you a few words about Pradip's talk, and hopefully he will forgive me for misrepresenting him and then correct the misrepresentations that I put forth. So we have here to participate in the discussion 3 absolutely wonderful scholars and colleagues of mine who I'm delighted to be working together with. They are the academic advisors to Phytopia. We have between themselves an ecologist who works on sustainability issues, a chemical ecologist, and an art historian. Shannon Olsson is a chemical ecologist who listens to nature's chemical conversations, as she says, across India's diverse ecosystems. A Fulbright scholar, Ramanujan and Inc. fellow, Shannon's research has been featured by CNN, Inverse, Cosmos, TEDx, Syntalk, SciIllustrate, my favorite Victoria and Albert Museum in London, DST Science Express Train, and the list is fairly long. What it tells us is that Shannon is deeply committed to public engagement with science. Shannon is currently director of the ECHO Network, an international public-private social innovation partnership steered by the principal scientific advisor to the Government of India. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you.
My next wonderful colleague is Harini Nagendra, well known to the city of Bangalore and well known to many of us. Harini is a professor of sustainability at Azim Premji University, where she anchors the Center for Climate Change and Sustainability. Over the last 20 years, her research has examined people-nature relationships in forests and cities from the perspective of both ecology and, more importantly, equity. For her interdisciplinary research and practice, she has received a number of awards, just like our previous panelist, including the 2009 Cozzarelli Prize from the United States National Academy of Sciences, which is a rather prestigious award, the 2013 Elinor Ostrom Senior Scholar Award, and the 2017 Clarivik Web of Science Award. Her publications include the books Nature in the City, Bengaluru in the Past, Present, and Future, and Cities and Canopies, the Tree Book of Indian Cities, which I recommend all of you to have a look at. It has wonderful stories. Welcome, Harini. And next is an art historian, Sita Reddy, whose introduction I must start with the most recent publication she put out together with other colleagues with the journal Marg, called Ars Botanica. It's an incredibly beautiful and well-researched book, which I recommend that you actually take a look at on our exhibition website. Dr. Sita Reddy is an independent scholar and museum curator based in Hyderabad now, but has, of course, traversed the world before this. And she writes on a range of topics at the intersection of art and science, ranging from the history of natural medicine to the decolonization of museums and archival justice. More recently, she edited the issue that I just spoke about. She has been fellow at the Smithsonian Institution, who we partnered with for our very first exhibition season called Submerge, and the Wellcome Library, from where we are taking curatorial assistance for our next exhibition, Contagion, so stay tuned for that. And she's a visiting professor at the University of Hyderabad in the Fine Arts Department. Her curatorial experience includes exhibitions on yoga, Ayurveda, forensic medicine, criminal photography, and contemporary art. She's currently working on a book on the Indian Medicinal Herbal Archive, provisionally titled The Jangala Books. She blogs on ajibghar.com and runs the online portal askbotanica.net. Welcome, Sita. And finally, to the star of the evening, Pradip Krishen, who just gave us an absolutely fascinating talk, which I will try to summarize as badly as I can in the next few minutes. Pradip needs no introduction, but I'll venture one. Pradip writes about trees and plants and works as an ecological gardener, mostly, as he likes to put it, in Western India, and the desert, where he has rewilded spoiled landscapes with native vegetation. He's the author of Trees of Delhi and Jungle Trees of Central India. He's now working on a fascinating journal-style book on Delhi's degraded Central Rich Forest. Most of us also remember him very well for a career that he has now disowned, or at least distanced himself from. The fascinating 3 films that he made, Mase Sahib in 1986, In Which Annie Gives It Those Ones in 1989, and Electric Moon in 1991. Welcome, Pradip. Pradip's talk that just got over, and we would love to talk to you about all the more that we can. Pradip just spoke about the attempt to rewild a park in Jaipur, and in many ways to try to bring back words like the Roi and the Thar, after which is the sort of origin of the name Thar for the Thar Desert. And his effort to create a park, which, as he jokingly said, but many of us probably might even sign under it, that the park, which is called Kishan Bagh, should probably be called Krishan Bagh, given his work in bringing it alive, which is not only an effort in rewilding, but also almost an effort in creating an artistic installation. I shouldn't even say almost. It is a work of art. It is an art installation, bringing native vegetation back into our lives. So I will misuse the privilege of being moderator for the discussion, and Pradip just ask you a couple of questions, or maybe make a couple of observations, following which I will request my co-panelists to also talk to you. I was very fascinated by your effort to reclaim, in a sense, the desert, which has been understood as a wasteland in contemporary India for the most part. And what I want to ask you is what that journey of, in a sense, reclaiming the wasteland, not only into a rewilded land with vegetation, but also how, in a way, to bring back the desert from the clutches of neglect into making it something so incredibly beautiful, as we saw from your pictures. So if I were to ask you, what has been the biggest challenge in making this transition possible? And what has been the most joyful moment in making that, conceptual as well as physical transition possible?
So I think that, the realization that the desert is not a wasteland is something that creeps up slowly on you. You have to travel, and you have to see, and you have to experience. And I think what's happened in Western Rajasthan is that, and this may sound a little rude, but the bits of the desert that are under the control of the forest department and that have been worked or reworked by agencies such as the Central Arid Zone Research Institute, they're appalling. So, for example, KAZRI, which is a central government institution that is concerned with the desert and for decades now has been publishing research about the desert. What they tend to do is, for example, they believe in borrowing tools from wherever they're available to achieve certain practical results. So, for example, if they're worried because dunes are encroaching on the roads, they want to tie down the dunes, and then they bring in an invasive tree from Africa, and they plant them densely on the dunes, and then you get these horrible acacia tortilis in dense stands. Nothing grows underneath, no bird nests in their branches. You see a devastation that is frightening, And then when you see these little patches of what we began to see was what we started to call SBK habitats, and then we realized was Rui, it was a very wonderful moment for us, I was traveling with these three friends, as I said in the talk, and we would get very excited because suddenly and these are small, as I said, they're small relict scattered patches, because the whole ecology of the desert has been so badly disrupted, by mining, by activities of KAZRI, and by the forest department. Now, I'll give you another example. There is a very, very beautiful landscape of a tall shrub or a small tree that is called the oak. It's the scientific name is Caligonum polygonoides, and it's now almost confined just to the borderlands with Pakistan, very remote areas. And one reason is that because the roots have a very high calorific value, they're valued by goldsmiths and charcoal makers for making charcoal and for having a really hot, for melting gold or whatever. But these are the climax vegetation of dunes, and they're perfectly at home in this slightly salty, very arid, very dry kind of place, and they're beautiful. But what the forest department does is they come and they clear fell these dunes, and they level the dunes, and absurd as it sounds, the government resettles dam ousties from distant parts of India, and they give them land in Jaisalmer, and they say, we have now leveled this land for you. We've brought in water from the Himalaya, along with in the Indira Gandhi Canal, and now you can start farming here. So the devastation is shocking. It's absolutely shocking. And I think that when you start noticing that, you also start seeing that, my God, but there are parts of the desert that are so, I'm not talking about their beauty. I'm just talking about the fact that they just seem so well, beautifully settled, and the vegetation just seems absolutely right. And now, for example, inside the Desert National Park, what's called the DNP, there is a huge effort to try and save the Great Indian Bustard, which is becoming very rare and endangered. And the Forest Department has decided, completely wrongly, that the bustard needs pure savan grassland, a monoculture of one grass, Lazarus syndicus. It's not true at all. They actually want the roi. They want the rois of those, of those dunes. So they actually clear everything else and just plant a monoculture of grasses. So, there is such naked aggression that is happening to the desert that you can't help but noticing what's happening. I don't know whether I've answered your question, but it's one aspect of what I wanted to talk about.
No, most certainly. And we will have time to discuss other questions. Could we maybe start with you, Sita? What would be your, please.
Yeah. We just saw the recreating the Roy video, but so when I was thinking about how to respond to what I've read and what I've watched other videos of Pradip's work in Rao Jodha Park, I wanted to respond inspired by, I think, the interdisciplinarity of Phytopia's programs and how art intersects science. I wanted to kind of like ask about how art can inform restoration of degraded landscapes, how it can perhaps help to re-articulate ecology. And I say this because my own work on botanical art in the MARG issue that Jahnavi mentioned was focused on what an archive forgets. You know, in our case, it was the names of the Indian creators of the so-called company school of botanical art. And I saw Pradip's, one version of Pradip's project as what the land forgets, right? So it's a form of eco-loss. How does one think about this? And I saw, I just watched a few days ago, I watched a webinar on rewilding that, Pradip, that you did with Govinda Bauli and moderated by Suprabha Seshan. And I was really struck by the fact that both you and Govinda, speaking from very different biomes, you know, one desert, one in the Eastern Ghats forest landscapes, were kind of pointed to art and culture as perhaps an initiating spur on how to reimagine what the land may have looked like, this lost vegetation. You with this 19th century British watercolor that you showed, that I wanted to kind of push you with, and Govinda with a 6th century poem in which he described, you know, elephants cavorting and streams, you know, like flowing streams and all of that. And, you know, like, I was also struck by the fact that finding that artwork, perhaps, or finding those traditional miners you worked with, the Khanwalias, may have been a bit of serendipity and luck and chance. And although it's sort of like it took a lot of work with working with local specificity, and not all projects have that kind of support and dedication, as you were just talking about, from patrons or from whether it's working with the forest department or with private owners. So my question is, I think 2 related questions. At a time when we have now sort of red lists of endangered ecosystems as well as individual species, at a time when it's most urgent to kind of green responsibly, at a time when corporate entities and public agencies are kind of like not allowing us to do anything but, how do we create a visual genealogy for conservation? One that looks, you know, both backward, archivally, you know, can we think about an art archive of lost landscapes, Roy, the Jangala that I work with, and, you know, the various misunderstandings, visual and lexical, and of course physical, that we have experienced, the land has experienced over time, and also forward. You know, how does one think forward pedagogically? Can one, for instance, think of this moment as a way in which we could help revive the dying tradition of botanical art? I don't mean individually. There are wonderful, there's an efflorescence of individual botanical art around, and, you know, you have Nirupa Rao and all that in your program. I'm talking of institutionally within art schools. Your botanical art, even colonial botanical art, company era botanical art, has always pushed science in some way, even though in an instrumentalist, illustrative way. And it was sort of they helped kind of botanically identify new species that were being collected in the colonies, the taxonomic impulse. Can we, in fact, see this moment as a way in which you can perhaps have a new historically, at the same time, you know, botanical art has not had much traction in art schools. It's not even called botanical art, it's called botanical illustration. It's kind of pejorative term. Can we see in projects like this of restoration, of rewilding, a way in which one could create an interdisciplinary, historically informed, ecologically engaged botanical art that could revitalize both art and science pedagogy?
Well, there's a lot of questions there, actually, Sita. I'll choose one little vein in that to try and answer some of the things you raised. You know, as I tried to say in the film, by trying to introduce the word Roi into the vocabulary that people use for the desert, I'm trying to get them to open their eyes. I'm trying to get them to look at things that otherwise they have overlooked. I want them to notice things, and I want them to be inspired by the fact that there are similar shrublands all over the world. You know, the mulga in Australia, the garrigue in the Mediterranean, the steenbok in South Africa, the chaparral in California, that people adore and photograph and visit and celebrate, but they conserve. And for me, I think that's the most important thing, that we have to somehow, you know, strive to get, to screech to a halt about destroying these habitats, you know. Because of my friend Pranay Lal, who's a great inspiration about rocks, I started looking at rocky landscapes in the desert with great interest. And when I've traveled in, say, in places like Namibia, it's wonderful how they celebrate their landscapes and how they have so much information about it and how everything is geared towards telling people. And here we have nothing, you know. You talk to foresters, who are basically the biggest landlords that there are in this country, under whose remit all these places exist. They don't know them, they don't understand them, they don't recognize them, they don't value them, you know. So we're at a very primitive stage of, I think, needing to first see that, look, we can't just go around destroying our natural landscapes, right? Roi is one of them, and it's a very fragile, easily disruptible kind of landscape. Rocks perhaps are not so easily disruptible, but you know, you can do tremendous damage very easily, even in very beautiful rocky landscapes. And this extends to things like, you know, rock art, cave art. You know, the earliest ways in which our remote ancestors have spoken to us, and we're destroying them at the rate of knots. You know, I have friends who do a lot of work with cave art and rock art, and they're just sort of holding their faces and saying, "Oh my God," you know. I mean, with new roads and there is complete, you know, there's a complete kind of blinkers on with the agencies that the government has, that either builds roads or builds railways or builds dams and deals with the environment. And we are at a very critical time in our country where we have a Ministry of Environment that basically is just a post box for big industry wanting to get permission to destroy forests, you know. It's a very, very dangerous moment. And unless we can awaken to this, we're going to be in huge trouble. But I don't know if I've answered your question, Sita, but it's one aspect of, I think, what you were saying.
I wonder if I can follow up. I was just mentioning to our mutual friend, Henry Nolte, that you were giving this talk, and Henry is one of the people who kind of painstakingly put together these dispersed archives. And he thought it extremely significant that you found topographical, ecological information in that watercolor, you know, and so wanted to know more and wondered if that could kind of open up a whole genre of, there are a whole range of watercolor paintings by Mem Saabs, by bored soldiers, and they don't rival in terms of conservation in art history of the oil paintings that are being conserved. So there could be a wealth of information in that kind of habitat knowledge. Anyway, so I just wanted to put that out there to say, he says hello.
Okay. All right.
Shannon, may I please invite you to a question for Pradip, please?
Absolutely. I very much enjoyed your talk, and as I do all my interactions with you, and it's actually a pleasure to finally somehow meet you during this during this time, as we meet anyone nowadays. So, you know, one of the things I really love about the Science Gallery, and I'm so honored to be a part of this effort, is how it actually brings science to people and allows them to engage with science, right? Rather than from an educational perspective or a communication perspective, really allowing them to think about science in a really interesting way through the lens of art or through the lens of innovation or discovery. And I really admire that. And one of the things when I was listening to your talk, and you use this term at the beginning of our session today, and Jahnavi also uses this term, this idea of a wasteland. As an ecologist, it's such a foreign term to my ears, because, you know, I work with insects. As a scientist, that's my job. And insects thrive in almost every known landscape except the deep ocean. So from my perspective, there is no such thing as a wasteland. Even an apartment building is filled with all sorts of interesting insect life, you know. And so, you know, what I wanted to ask you, because the other hat that I wear as this director of this network, where we really want to engage science and society better together, and like I said, the thing I admire most about the Science Gallery is how do we bring scientists into this conversation in a better way? Because we scientists have this understanding of ecosystems, and that there is no such thing as a wasteland, except for something that has been completely destroyed by humans, right, beyond recognition. But yet the public, and perhaps the people that are making decisions, you mentioned the Bustard situation, you know, where they had certain interpretations of things. So how do we better marry this together? You did this wonderful thing in this desert landscape, which we often hear about being a wasteland, as you so beautifully showed, is not. It's a place of immense life. So how can we scientists actually better work with people like yourself, with the Science Gallery, and with others to really start to better convey this information of what does that mean? What does that term wasteland mean in terms of India's great variety of ecosystems?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I have a prescription, but what I do want to say is that I think one of the most important players here is the Forest Department. And the Forest Department has, I think it dipped in its quality, the quality of instruction that young foresters receive at the FRI in Dehradun is, you know, I think is really poor now. Their awareness and knowledge about ecology is almost non-existent. So I think one very important input could be actually trying to ramp up the syllabus and what people learn and what people understand when they are training to become foresters. Because it's pathetic. I mean, there are some brilliant individuals in the Forest Department who are shining exceptions. But I'll tell you a story that illustrates this well. There's a place called Pachmari in Madhya Pradesh, and it's up in the Satpura hills, and it has a national park that was inaugurated in 1981. And Dr. Salim Ali inaugurated the park, and the first park director from the Forest Department must have thought he wants to plant a row of trees in what is Central India's most diverse, most interesting natural habitat. So he must have scratched his head and said, now what should I plant that visitors would like to see when they first drive into the park? Not for very long, for maybe the first half a kilometer or so. And after what I think must be careful cogitation, he chose to plant eucalyptus trees. Now, I cannot get inside his head. You know, I cannot understand how a forester who is supposed to know about biodiversity, know about forests, and know about trees, decides to plant the bloody eucalyptus tree as an ornamental avenue when people enter the most diverse national park in the country. You know, but it illustrates what is happening with foresters today and their mindset. And you know, there are a few other players involved with nature in the way that we're speaking. One is one is municipal horticulture. You see, this is a figure that I love to trot out. We have 2,600 species of native trees in this country. Do you know that we use not more than about 50 or 60? That's less than 2% of our natural wealth of native trees, right? It's a shocking statistic. And it almost condemns us as a civilization that is blind to the richness that is out there, Why is it that we can't, obviously we can't plant all 2,600, but surely 400, 600, 60 trees. And the blame for this is municipal horticulturists, nursery work, people who actually run nurseries, and they're just beginning to get decent nurseries. Pune is suddenly becoming a hub of interesting nurseries. I know that Auroville has got some very interesting nurseries for their kind of, dry evergreen forest. And then, lastly, landscape architects. We have a landscape architecture scene in this country, and this may not be true everywhere, but what I've seen of it, their model for landscaping our cities is the palmscapes of Dubai and Sharjah. It's completely shocking. But what students of landscape architecture learn in architecture school is not about plants, is not about ecology. They learn about how to make drawings, how to make plans, how to do the civil work infrastructure for swales and drainage and things like that. But plants do not figure, right? So I think that these four people, the people who run and make nurseries, the forest department primarily, the whole tribe of municipal horticulturists and landscape architects, we need to influence them somehow. And I'm sure that they would all welcome people like yourself, Shannon, and scientists coming in and saying, look, we would like to help you because you have a very shallow understanding of biodiversity. Does that answer your question to some extent? It's a very broad question, actually, but so I've just chosen one little.
It is a broad question, but it was meant to answer as you did. Thank you so much.
Harini, may I request you to carry the baton forward?
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to be on a panel with you, Pradip. And I was last March with my family. We'd gone to the Raujodha National Park, and it was really hot, but we managed to make it before the heat hit us in good force. And what an amazing experience it was. I especially loved, as Jahnavi was saying, the whole seamlessness of art and ecology and rocks, and how it was such a learning experience as well as a visual experience, as well as just an experience of being with the right kind of nature. So I think it was just fabulous, and thank you so much for that. I'd actually like to ask you a provocative question, and I say this question as an ecologist who completely is, or I should say a large part of me is completely very sympathetic with your quest for rewilding or restoring ecosystems to what they should have been. But I wonder what you would think of, for instance, the atrial work that you are well aware of in bunny grasslands, where they argue that with prosopis spreading all across, or at least half of the bunny, it's become a novel ecosystem where livelihoods have changed from pastoralism to charcoal making to accommodate this. And so if you really removed prosopis and rewilded or restored ecosystems at a scale, which is difficult to do, but if one thought as a thought experiment to get bunny back to what it was, what would be the ecological, social, and economic impacts? We know what the ecological impacts would be, but they would involve some transitions in wildlife because wildlife is accommodated. Or similarly in Delhi or Bangalore. And again, I'm very sympathetic to the ideas of removing certain kinds of trees that just don't belong in these cities. Eucalyptus is a very good example. But, take the rain tree, for instance. And Bangalore's also got a lot of concrete. And maybe the rain tree should not have been here in the kind of Bangalore it was. But the fact is that asphalt is about 25, 30 degrees hotter in the sun than it is anywhere else. And there are a number of people out on the roads, typically migrant workers, street vendors, etc., who do need this kind of shade, especially in the summer. You want something with leaves in the summer. So if you went back to the kind of scrubby vegetation that was available in Bangalore, you would not, because you can't remove the concrete. That's a given in the city, unfortunately. So it's just a provocative question. Do you feel like, I know you have a tree list in Delhi, and I love your tree list because it really goes back to a lot of the original trees. But do you feel that these kinds of things can be done in certain ecosystems and not in others that have completely transformed?
I think there are all kinds of shades of differences, Harini. I'm sure that in the bunny, which I don't know well, but what I know of the work that's happening there, I think the choice that is being made is to cater to the needs of people who live there, poor people who live there, instead of taking radical ecological decisions. And that's a choice that people can make. But I don't know whether they know what a pristine ecological restoration would actually look like in the bunny, because I don't know whether it's been tried, but maybe, perhaps. One thing that I have learned to expect is that I haven't come across any kind of landscape anywhere in this country that doesn't have a thriving native vegetation that looks, beautiful, that is sustainable, and all of that. But when I argue for bringing in native vegetation to places like Delhi, for example, I'll tell you what it's animated by. It's animated by the idea of sustainability. So what the British did when they planted up Delhi's roads was that they decided essentially, in the early part of the 20th century, that they wanted to have evergreen trees. They didn't want trees to be bare. And to be evergreen in Delhi is to go completely against the grain. It's to walk uphill, because the natural ecology of Delhi is to have deciduous trees that shut down and become dormant in the dry season when there is, no water available. So to have an evergreen tree means that, and what the British did was they made the huge mistake of going into a dry forest and saying, we've got the jamun. The jamun is evergreen. Look, let's take it to Delhi. But the jamun is evergreen because it grows next to a perennial stream. And if you take the jamun to Delhi, yes, it will do well on Rajpath because the lawns are being watered all the time. But it's not really a tree that is at all comfortable in away from a perennial stream. So the other thing is that there, and this is slightly different from what you asked me, Harini, but it's something I want to talk about. I'm very interested in the fact that when I was exploring central India in about 5 years ago, for several years, there were effects that I saw in the jungle that are utterly beautiful. And I refer in particular to the reds happening to trees. When dry deciduous trees put on new leaves, they're almost always in the red part of the spectrum. Almost always. And this was beautiful and wonderful to see, but also intriguing because you didn't quite know why this was happening. And nature doesn't tend to do things for no reason. And obviously, this is something that happens to trees, in temperate climates in autumn, when the red gets exposed because chlorophyll is withdrawn. And here the opposite is happening. We're seeing the red because the chlorophyll hasn't entered the leaf yet. So, I began to think about what's happening. Basically, in a nutshell, what I discovered was that probably what's happening is that these trees are, insects who are the biggest predators of leaves and of new leaves in particular, don't see in the long wavelength. Right. So they don't see reds. And as a result, to be red is to be cryptic, is to be hidden from your greatest predator. So it's just a brilliant solution that, the trees have found to not be eaten by beetles. But the effect is so beautiful that I often wonder, why don't landscape architects, when they're planting in Delhi, for example, why don't they use the red as the epiphany of spring? There are some trees that do it in Delhi. You'll see avenues of Pilkand, for example, that have these gorgeous tints of pinks and reds and bronzes, and it's just absolutely wonderful. but you could do it at a much bigger scale. And one of the things I want to do and hope to do is to actually be able to speak to landscape architects and say, look, open your eyes, look at these things. Don't just plant the same tired suite of 60 trees because they're the only ones available in nurseries. But we also need to revolutionize nurseries and actually have a much bigger suite of trees that are available for planting. But one more little point before you can throw it open to the audience is that we were talking about this when we were talking with Supi and Govinda the other night. That rewilding can happen at a very, very small scale in cities. It doesn't need to happen, only on avenues or only on the central ridge or only on big parks. But so much, they use the word ruderals, right, for weeds. And the idea of a weed is actually anathema to me. Nothing is a weed, right? I mean, there are plants I don't want in Kishanbagh, and I remove them because they're so aggressive. But nothing is a weed, really. But you can do such beautiful things, even in little gullies and lanes and sidewalks, and some years ago we had a very sympathetic head of the NDMC horticulture in Delhi, and I said, why don't you grow more hedges along all the low walls that you have in Lutyens, Delhi? You have these, because what hedges do is they soften the hard edges of these walls, but they also create habitat for insects, for birds, for other creatures. And I was so happy to see that he actually began that process. So there's a lot that we can still do in our cities, but we need an enlightened horticulture system. I was in Australia a few years ago, and I realized that when horticulturists are trained there, the first thing they study is the history of Western art, and you compare that to what our horticulturists study. I have a phrase that a horticulturist once used to me. He said that, "Hum itne deep mein nahi jaate." We don't go into any depth, he said. Our work is to give water and to do gudai. That's all we do, And that is really the pathetic aspect of where we are, right?
Thanks.
So what I hear from you, Pradip, is a plea for a revision of curriculum. And I think I hear that to some extent also from what Shannon said. And of course, Sita, you led the discussion by calling for a curriculum revival, by trying to bring in precisely these kinds of perspectives that come from across disciplines and merge into practice. And therefore, how we might actually better inform the work, and that some of you are already doing, but also take it, to a much wider public, to inform new curricula, to inform new teaching practices. And I'm hoping that, we'll all continue to work together to make some of this happen, and that this is only a start. So with this, I'm throwing, as they say, the podium open to the public for questions. And from what I see here, there are questions also for my co-panelists. I'll start with a question from Tarun Nair, who wants to know, Pradip, from you, if there is a role for native fauna in the rewilding process. Because he, as he mentions, he was involved in a wildlife rehabilitation project a while ago. And, thinking of sort of, species like lizards and hedgehogs and, others, including rescue animals, who, if introduced into these areas, can create all sorts of things like burrows, etc., and just enliven and animate the landscape very much more. So could you tell us a little bit more about the role of and the presence of fauna in your project?
Yeah, well,
large and small, both.
Because we work in what are relatively small pockets. Rajodha Park is about 70 hectares in the middle of a dense city. And Kishanbagh is about 51 hectares, also in the middle of a big city. They're slightly different in that, if we had allowed porosity in the fencing of Rajodha Park, we would have had cows and donkeys and camels and other creatures coming in and actually doing a lot of damage. But we love the idea of fauna. I mean, I think that to rewild without a natural fauna is absurd. But you need bigger parcels of land. You need land that can actually take, grazers and the whole gamut of creatures. But there's lots of, we were very, very pleased to do a study of the birds that, and so basically it's only flying things that can discover an island in a city, right? Only things that can fly in. So we have a bird count of 203 species of birds in Jodhpur city, up from about 40, which is when we sort of started looking at them, which wasn't right at the beginning, which was a bit later. But it's an amazing statistic that in a desert, in a small parcel of land, just by diversifying the kinds of trees and the things that birds would eat, you can get a huge ramping up of numbers for birds. We've tried to do that for butterflies. We've got a reasonable number of butterflies. I'm sure it's probably true of things like grasshoppers. It's probably true of. We were surprised to discover that, and this is not something we learned ourselves, but through somebody else, that we probably have a diversity of termites that is quite rich, and that we were advised that, look, if you really want to rewild this place, the termites are the base of your food chain, of your, what you should do is actually throw scantlings of the precipice whenever it's being removed, because that will encourage the termites. But then the termites, because they're the base, will give you a much richer ecosystem, So yes, we would, I don't think that 70 hectares can take herds of nilgais or chinkaras or herbivores like that in big numbers. So it would have to be very selective. But ideally, rewilding is all about creating the wilderness in all its diversity and all its glory. So definitely fauna as well.
So we have someone asking about a previous effort to make a cactus garden that might not have worked, and why you think that might have happened, and or why or in a sense, why didn't that take off? And I'll club another question with it, which is, how have you been thinking about fire prevention, given sort of the nature of the vegetation? And finally, what about sacred groves in these areas? I've clubbed 3 questions now. There's lots of.
I hope I remember all 3 questions.
I'll remind.
So the cactus garden was just somebody's harebrained idea, I think. All we know is that we saw the remains of the civil works that that stayed back after the cactus garden failed. But it was, people do make cactus gardens in India. It was tried on a very large scale in this Kishanbagh area. And, I don't know exactly why it failed, but obviously they didn't know what they were doing. See, can I just spend a few minutes talking about the role of government making gardens like the cactus garden and other gardens? So I've talked about the fact that we work with JDA, right? And it wasn't easy to work with JDA. And yet, we have to give them credit for backing a project like this. And we have to give the government of Rajasthan credit, because it doesn't matter whether it's been the BJP or whether it's been the Congress. Sometimes what happens in places, in some states, is that, the government changes, and just like sort of a new male tiger moving into a territory will kill all the cubs because they've been sired by another male. Everything is destroyed. But we've had support no matter what the government is. And the fact that JDA has supported a project like this, even though they didn't fully understand what was going on. Throughout the project, there's been people saying, pata nahi aap log kya kar rahe ho? What are you up to? Why are you doing this? So it's quite remarkable that you can get a government organization that will come to the table and say, okay, look, we'll back you, and let's give it a try, right? the cactus garden would have been one such idea that obviously failed. But I just want to, doff my hat to them and say thank you for supporting this project and for being with us, and for also being with us in our efforts to now hand over to another agency that actually has the right credentials. It's really very important that we do that. But so much for the cactus garden. But there's lots of room to do thematic gardens. I think a cactus garden is not a good theme simply because cacti are purely American. All cacti are New World. They're either North America or South America. And to try and do a cactus garden in India is a bit quirky. I mean, there are some cactus gardens in India, but I know a very interesting succulent garden in India, and they could have done a succulent garden. But it needs a lot of expertise. It needs the right kind of management, and you cannot do it with, you certainly can't do it in the L1 system. See, I understand why the government has to use an L1, the lower system of funding out projects. I understand that it's an attempt to curb corruption or to reduce corruption, but the fact of the matter is it doesn't reduce corruption, and it encourages, it leads to a situation basically where the people who have bid the least amount of money are only interested in making up that money somehow, making as much money as they can by doing as little as possible. So the L actually is as little as possible, but not the least amount of money. And it's something that government, I think, needs to reconsider. It's just not a good system, right? What was the second question, Harini?
No worries. About preventing fires, right? Like
preventing fire. Well, we've actually had fires, especially in the grassy places. But we just create fire lanes. Most of the fires have happened because of Diwali patakas, rockets that have gone and landed in dry grass at Diwali, and we've just had to make fire lanes, and it's very effective. And it's very interesting that a plant like buoy is completely fireproof. So you've had a fire sweep through the Medan, and everything is gone. All the grasses are gone, except for buoy. Buoy just remains green and happy. But the grasses, having gone, are not destroyed. They just spring up again from their rootstock, without, and within a few weeks, they're all green and poking out again. And the third question was, sorry,
no worries. Sacred groves. Sacred groves in the desert.
Yeah, so I mean, I've seen, they're called orans in Rajasthan, and orans tend to be, they tend to be protected landscapes. They tend to be primarily bare trees. At least the orans that I've seen in the desert tend to be bare deciduous trees that are protected, but there's almost nothing on the ground, because animals are allowed in there, so basically Rajasthan also suffers from a huge surfeit of domesticated animals. So it's not like pastoralism. It's much more intense than that. It's really the man-animal ratio in Rajasthan, Western Rajasthan, is horrifying. But I mean, if you're asking me my opinion about sacred groves, I mean, I think they're a great idea. I think the idea that people, I mean, certainly in much richer habitats like Madhya Pradesh, I've seen that, when, especially in tribal communities, when people make, little deities at the feet of trees and worship them, that is really our last hope for some of these forests. They're absolutely gorgeous what they do, but not so. I've never been impressed with sacred forests that I've seen in Western Rajasthan, where I felt, what a great job, and what a beautifully preserved natural habitat.
The sociologist Amita Bhaviskar is with us. I'm very happy, Amita, to see you here. She has a question for you, Pradip, following on Sita's comments. where what she wants to say is that your gorgeous photographs are also crucial for showing people how to perceive the beauty of the desert. Would you characterize this then as a part of your art?
No, but I'll tell you what is, or what has been really important to both these projects, the Rajodha Park and Kishan Bagh, and that is that design and trying to make things, in an attractive, beautiful way has been really important. I was extremely lucky to have Golak, who is the same person who worked with me in Kishan Bagh, work with me closely to, we were given a 4-century-old historical gateway into the city of Jodhpur to make our visitor center in Jodhpur, and it was a complete shambles. And we got Golak in, and we said, Golak, how do we celebrate rock? How do we make a visitor center that feels like? And we started exploring. We had no ideas to start with, really, but we started visiting all these very interesting mines that were just, maybe 2 kilometers away from us in Jodhpur. And we started discovering all these wonderfully natural ripple stones in sandstone, and we brought them back. And one thing led to another, and I think we made a very beautiful visitor center in Jodhpur, and it became really important. And then for all the signage and for all the, somebody called Kadambari Mishra, who was my designer for the Jungle Trees book, and who just is an absolutely incredible visualizer. She came in and did the most beautiful signage for us, and the most beautiful logos, and that's been just wonderful in Jodhpur. So it's always, I think, a very important part of what one does, that you have to make it attractive for people, but you also have to make it slightly wacky or slightly quirky, perhaps, and that's Golak's hallmark, I think, and maybe that's my hallmark as well.
Well, we've seen some of that, as you say, in the 20th century. So, that only continues. The next question I have for you is from Jasmina Salam, who was wondering if there was any desert microbiology study done for or during the designing of the project. And more crucially, do visitors get to learn about the abundant micro life in deserts as well?
Unfortunately not. We'd love to do it, but we didn't have the resources. We didn't think of it in time. And if you don't think of it in time, when you're submitting a project to government, you have to just say, well, too bad, now it's too late, you can't do it. But it's something that we'd love to build on. I mean, even though I now am about to relinquish control over Kishan Bagh, I think it would be really important to do that, because it's so important in the soil. I mean, it's not just about mycorrhiza, but all kinds of microbial things that are really important to the desert, and are really important to understanding why things happen in the desert. But I mean, I completely agree. It's really important that we undertake that.
Someone has a question saying, what is the water source for this campus, or for this rewilded area?
Starting with Jodhpur, when I was first invited to create, the words that were used to me in Rajodha Park in Jodhpur were, can you green this landscape for us? And it already basically it was chock-a-block full of Prochopis juliflora, this South American, invasive tree. And so the person who was asking me this was the CEO of the trust, and he I think he sensed that we needed to remove this tree. But I also sensed that in his mind's eye, he had a vision of, lovely grassland with flowering trees, but some kind of English park, perhaps, next to this wonderful iconic fort. And I said to him, look, if we were to try and, green it in that sense, we would have to bring in millions, literally millions of tons of soil, and we would have to water every single plant, every single day of our life for the rest of time. Is that what you want? And he said, well, when you put it like that, obviously no. So we don't actually, we learned, it took us time, but we learned how to plant the right things in the right places. when we see a plant that is dying for want of water, we say, let it die. It is the wrong plant in the wrong place. We need to replace it with something that's going to survive on its own. Because when you go out into the desert, into rocky places, you see plants growing there without, and nobody's going around watering them, right? So there has to be a way of being able to plant the right things so that there needs no watering at all. So we have one little, it's not quite a stream, but it's what we call a CML, which stands for a convenient municipal leak. So we have a pipe that leaks a little bit of water, but it gives us a tiny amount of moisture that actually moves through the park. And you can see that moisture is so critical that lots of things are growing there in a much more dense way than anywhere else. But most of the park has no irrigation. There's a lake or two, but things that grow along the fringe of the lake. But essentially, it's a completely dry. And we want the same thing to happen in Kishenbagh. So Kishenbagh, the tactic is simply this: you plant in the rain, you support the plant until it gets established, which means for 3 or 4 months, typically till about December, right? So you need some irrigation, you need pipes and ways of irrigating them for a few months after the rain. After that, they have to survive on their own. And if they're not surviving on their own, there's something wrong with what you've chosen to plant in a particular place. And you have to change that. So we have to learn about that. And that's what we do. We don't intend to actually water our plants in Kishenbagh either. And we don't water them. It has to be plants that can survive without any assistance in that landscape.
So in a way, you answered Nilambari's question, which was about your baseline. What was your baseline for reforesting? Rewilding, sorry. There's several suggestions and questions like, would you consider teaching in a landscape architecture college in India, for example? Or would you be willing to write a book about shrubs and grasses of the Thar so that people can read and learn more about it? Yeah. Then there are also, so many such absolutely wonderful suggestions. And I'm happy to pass on the contact details to you for you to talk to these people. Someone wants to incite you into working more in the Western Ghats. If you're up for that, you should let our audience know.
I should announce, Jahnavi, that I'm not doing any more rewilding. I am now a retired rewilder because I want to write. And I think that by writing, I can communicate to more people, and I can perhaps hopefully inspire more people, but also tell them about what we've done, the mistakes we've made, so that nobody needs to reinvent the wheel from scratch all over again. They can just go on from, in a place like Jodhpur, for example, if you want to plant in desert rock, you don't need to learn all the basic lessons from scratch, because the truth is, there is no information available about these kinds of techniques. All the botany that you have, and you have floras of almost every part of India, but floras are essentially lists of plants arranged phylogenetically by family, according to the ways in which botanists think that plants have evolved. But there's almost no information about ecology or soils or the kind of micro niches that they grow in. So all of that information I'd love to pass on of what I know, right? And I do intend, when I actually retired from Rajodha Park on the 31st of March of this year, respecting the financial year. And my intention was that I would now get down to writing, first of all, about what we did in Rajodha Park, the mistakes we made, the learning we made, and then do a detailed field guide to all the little plants, all of the 250, 260 little plants, big and little plants we have in Rajodha Park, and then do a field guide to the trees and large shrubs of the desert, because there are not a lot of trees in the desert. So trees alone wouldn't make up enough of a book. But because of the lockdown, I've had to postpone some of those plans. And I'm now, as you've mentioned, I'm now writing a book about the Central Ridge instead.
Wonderful. I think that is a lovely moment to begin to sort of wrap up. There are questions that are still coming in. I would urge our audiences to put the questions under the link to Pradip's talk, and we will be happy to take them to him and seek answers to them. It has been absolutely wonderful to listen to you, Pradip, and to the fascinating opening for this exhibition that you provided by talking about, trees and plants of the desert, and which for us is the most apt and lovely way to open this exhibition. May I ask my co-panelists if you have probably a word or two to say?
I have a word to say.
Absolutely, it's your day.
I just want to thank the Science Gallery, Bengaluru, and all your lovely co-panelists for this great opportunity. I've dreamt about this moment of being able to say, this is announcing to the world that, look, let me tell you what a ROI is. And that announcement I thought would happen in the past, but actually it's happened through your online session. So thank you so much for making it happen, and thank you for just working so genially and so beautifully on something that I've enjoyed very much.
It is a privilege. It has been a privilege. Harini, Sita, Shannon, may I ask you, Shannon, to go first?
I just want to thank you, Jahnavi, and my co-panelists for bringing Pradip here. It was wonderful to listen to him, inspiring, and I hope that everyone who's listening today and everyone who has the opportunity here after this will also think about their own areas. India is such a remarkable country with such diverse ecosystems, and especially its plant life is phenomenal and has so much possibilities for us who live there. So I hope that this inspires others to think about their local areas and how they can keep them beautiful or make them beautiful again, if that's the case. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Shannon. Harini?
Thanks. It was just a lovely talk and discussion. And I think one of the lessons I'm taking away from this is that rewilding and restoration is something as much as we need for ecology and landscapes as for our imaginations. And we really need to restore our ecological imaginations. And I think this is a great start. And I'm looking forward to what goes on next.
Absolutely. Sita?
Thank you so much, Pradip. I sort of was, as people were inviting you to come and teach at landscape architecture courses, I was thinking about the curricular possibilities here. Come and teach in the art school, and there are ways in which one can weave these concepts, lexical, semantic, visual, together in such interesting ways. And so just thank you.
There's something that I want everybody to take away, and that is that I'm not alone. I belong to, it's a small tribe, but it's a tribe of people who are doing this kind of work in different parts of the country. Sometimes in a very lonely way, sometimes in a very unsupported way, sometimes well supported. But there's Divya and Sridhar deep down south. There's Supi Supravasation working in Wayanad. There's Govinda who we saw there. There's some wonderful people in Auroville who I don't even know, I haven't even met, but I read about them and I intend to go there one day. There are people like Vijay Dasmana and I Am Gurgaon doing wonderful things here, right close to me. And I think that all of these people need to be basically collared, I think, by all of you and said, look, come in and participate, in these kinds of things and tell us about what we can do, because it's really important. And one of the things I take great pleasure in, Sita, now is, I talk to a few younger people who are all who developed a very sharp interest in this kind of work. With people like Fazal Rashid and Somil Daga. There's Padmavati Dwivedi in Delhi, who's suddenly madly interested in plants. It's something that you can actually pass on quite easily. There are people like Kavita, who's people who I started going out on tree walks with, who are now doing their own tree walk. So there's a lovely sense of these ripples going out and people being able to sort of learn and then pass it on. And this is, I think, part of the fundamental process of spreading the word and hoping that it will, do good.
Absolutely. So 3 takeaways as far as I see them. The first is to get all of you back to work with us, to think about a curriculum maybe. I'll take you all up on that. And I think that would be a lovely thing to do, in fact. So an invitation to work with us on that. Second, as Harini has already noted, in the move from sustainability towards regeneration of ecological sources, of resources of the planet, I think that's a message that we would like all of our viewers to take with them, that, regeneration is where we need to move if sustainability has to become an idea that can be operationalized or that can be, brought into our lives on a daily basis. And third, not least, it is really a privilege to be able to take an idea that Pradip has been working with for so long and have the opportunity to bring it to all of you, the idea of the ROI, and bring it into the public domain, into public discourse, and provide the inspiration for this to be the point of departure to think equally seriously and with tenderness and with love about other ecosystems that are around us, and something that Shannon also hinted at. So these are my 3 takeaways. I'm sure you have yours. Thank you, Sita, Harini, Shannon, and Pradip, for an absolutely fascinating evening. To the audience, it is very, very important for us to learn your thoughts and responses to this. And so may I please urge you to fill the feedback form in the chat box and visit the exhibition Phytopia. We have similar talks lined up between today and the end of the exhibition in 10 days. There'll be speakers from all over the world, experts and young people joining us to share knowledge about plants and more plants. Your feedback is important because it allows us to understand whether we are doing the right thing or not, but it also allows us to make a case for why public engagement with science is crucial, essential, and absolutely necessary if we are to have the wonderful reimaginations or the new imaginaries for a better world that Harini spoke about have to become real. So please take this seriously. Let us know what you think. Tell us what we need to do better, and tell us what we did well as well. Thank you very much, and do visit Phytopia.